Sorry, everyone.
But
I've just kick-started a recording
that's all
so
right.
that we can share something with the other 80 people who didn't turn up tonight.
So the internet was intended to solve those problems. But what we discover is that the internet is AI driven, and the energy being consumed by AI is growing exponentially, right? And so, there's an unintended consequence of the solution for the travel problem of using Zoom, for argument's sake. Um, so, yeah, we can travel less, but how we solve the traveling less problem without creating another problem, the unintended consequences, which we discuss in the book as well, is yet another issue. So, Nick, did you want to move on?
Yeah, let's let you loose on your slides, Damon. I think if you're
Yes.
if you're happy to.
Yeah, I am. And so, look, let, let me just start. Um, I wanted to show this one because we've been talking about wealth and human consumption. I'm just going to get rid of all your wonderful faces because I can't see my slides here. Uh, this one, we were interested in showing how everything always relates to things like GDP, and of course GDP is just another way of saying population in many respects, because humans generate GDP. But this slide shows you the extraordinary correlations with GDP and things like the number of Earths we are consuming, which is this black line here. It's linear with GDP. Um, Global electricity production, linear with GDP. World car fleet, linear with, I can go on, but it just shows you the pervasive strength of wealth on the impact of consumption. I'll come back to this point. But what you also see here later on, what you also see here is just the growth. This plot has been normalized to all the values in 2017, which is why they're all one. And it's GDP is measured in PPP, which is sort of saying average purchase power of US dollar. And half of that one value so if we halve the value of 2017 over here, then this is roughly 1991 for a lot of these values. So that just shows you the growth in GDP over this time. So with half the GDP, you get these values. So that wasn't that long ago. So this growth has occurred extraordinarily in the last 3 decades, maybe 4. And as someone noted, growth in China has been a big driver for a lot of what we're seeing, particularly as the OECD, growth in the OECD in terms of energy and so on, starts to fall down a little bit through the export of manufacturing to China and the growth of the Chinese economy. I'll come back to this data later, but I thought it would be interesting to look at these different aspects of consumption. My major focus in what I'm going to talk about will be energy, including things like electricity production. But this is just one of the extraordinary things we see amongst all the disparate types of data that's out there. I won't go through this in detail, but one of the themes of the book, which I've had a PhD student developing, is EROI, the I missing G. The G stands for green. EROI ostensibly is an energy payback, as you all know, and it looks, I'm going to use some pretty loose definitions for the moment. It looks at the ratio of energy delivered to the ratio of, the amount of energy delivered to the value of how much it costs to generate that energy. The direct energy inputs are related to construction of an energy plant, they're related to operation of an energy plant, and its decommission. You may include indirect and other costs in that. You may look at the ROI at the point of use, of the user. You might take it all the way back to the minerals. There are a whole range of boundary conditions that you might consider in this, and we've discussed some of those. We include in this, to get the G on this, to get the green ROI, indirect costs related to what we term ESME costs, and someone mentioned those before. So Jessica, my PhD student, who's going to be graduating later this month, has just written a lot of papers on this topic. And in effect, The ESME costs is ostensibly trying to include in energy accounting the cost of sustaining the Earth's ecosystem. We measure the Earth's ecosystem through the services it provides, and those services, obviously to humans, are things like food, fibre, clean air and water, climate regulation, and so on. We include those as an energetic value in energy accounting. I showed you before the number of Earths, which is like an ecological footprint. So the measurement there is basically consumption. And in the end, you can route that back to so much consumption in respect of how much capacity the Earth has to regenerate that consumption. You can use dollars for these things as well. How much does it cost to sustain the environment? The trouble with dollars is that there's a whole lot of subsidies, and it's very hard to work out what those dollars are. We use energy as the metric because energy accounting, after all, is a very well-known area, and putting an energy cost against an ecosystem service is a good way of including it in an ROIG calculation. So in effect, what we're trying to do is to work out how much energy is needed to restore the damage to the ecosystem from the operation of an energy system. Once you understand how much energy is required to restore the damage, you can include that as an indirect energy cost. I won't go through this information here, but I will if anyone's interested. We calculate ESME, and I'll go through this very quickly. Choose an energy technology, size the plant, how big is it, what's its footprint, and so on. We can include the impact of biodiversity loss based on the size of the plant. I'll go through that in a moment. We undertake a full life cycle assessment of the plant. The life cycle assessment is used to determine the impacts on the ecosystem of the plant. So these include things like damage to water, damage to air, and so on. For example, emissions of greenhouse gases, emissions of dioxins, emissions of NOx particulates, et cetera, et cetera. It includes scarcity and other things like that. So it's a standard life cycle assessment. For each of those life cycle assessments, we assign something called an impact source removal technology. Give you an example of that. If you've got carbon dioxide coming from your plant, you can include energy required to remove the carbon dioxide. So you can separate the carbon dioxide out from the exhaust if it's coming from a stack. You can then use an amine solution, for example, to convert that into something which you can then sequester. The energy cost of doing that is a part of the ESME cost. For every impact, we have some form of technology which has an energy consumption required to operate that technology. So we calculate all of those. We undertake a full life cycle energy assessment, including energy needed to build, operate, commission the plant, and so on. We include all the ESME costs. We then include the cost of biodiversity offset land. If you have a very large plant, and some of these large energy plants are getting into the thousands of square kilometres, once you've got a plant that size, the biodiversity impact can be significant. So you've then got to assign offset land, and you have to operate that offset land for the duration of the plant. There are transfers of greenhouse gases and so on between the offset land and so on, which I won't go into. But in effect, we can include to some extent biodiversity offsets. And so then we can calculate the ROI, ESME, and the ROIG. And so here are some values for those, for some things we've looked at, and some people have already raised some of these values. So given that there was a large discussion of this in the book, I'm going through this very quickly, but just to give you a sense for how we can do this. The first thing we looked at was a concentrating solar plant. We did not include biodiversity offsets in that because we hadn't worked out how to do it at that point. The plant had natural gas backup. And so the ROI calculations for zero natural gas backup were 9.5. For natural gas backup of 20%. So this is because, for example, the energy stored in the molten salts of the plant might not last sufficiently long, given an overcast series of days. And so that pushes it to 11.7. So you see the impact of putting fossil fuels into the plant lifts the ROI, naturally enough. But what it does do is drop the ROIG because you have to deal with increased production of greenhouse gases. What you also notice is that there is a huge difference in the ROI and the ROIG of these plants. In other words, there are, even for a renewable plant like a CSP plant, significant environmental costs of operating these plants because of the life cycle assessments that you've done. We've looked at wind and solar. You see the values here. We've looked at including battery storage. We've looked at renewable manufacturing. In other words, build the plant based on a fossil fuel economy, build the plant based on a renewable economy, and you get the differences there. I merely show you these numbers. Someone mentioned the difference between wind and solar PV EROI values. They're quite significant. But we're seeing solar PV coming up be much better now than what it was historically. So that's a great improvement. We've also looked at bioenergy, which I won't go through in any detail, but really bioenergy is much mentioned in many of the IPCC future energy scenarios. And you'd have to question why, given the EROI of that, particularly given that the EROI G is in fact less than 1. So if you're interested in finding out more about this, I can give you the references later on. So this is a very developing area. We're the only ones looking at this. In fact, I guess we invented it. And Jessica is the person who's done most of the number crunching on this for us. So that was just a very quick overview of that area. In other words, we're trying to understand what the true sustainably supplyable amount of energy you can get from an energy system. Of course, paying the ESME cost restores the damage. What it doesn't take is account of the damage already done. In the case of greenhouse gases, if you want to take account of the damage already done, you've got to start having negative emission technologies. You need to pull out CO2 from the atmosphere. And that comes at an extraordinary cost because of the dilution that occurs in the atmosphere. So that was just a very quick overview of some of the themes of the book. What I wanted to do now I should pull you all up. If you've got any questions, just stop me because I'll just keep on going, right? I'll get into bulldozer mode. Probably not a good thing to say at a meeting like this, but you know what I mean, right? So I wanted to get into a deeper dive of the themes of the book. In all of these arguments, data is everything, right? A couple of people have already said they've looked at different data and found different outcomes. Yeah, it's a dog's breakfast out there. So there are data sources that I use and I trust, and they're free. So what's not to like about them? I'll show you some of those. And I urge you to look at those databases to form your own opinions. Most of them are in simple Excel spreadsheets you can download and you can plot to your heart's content, as I've been doing. And you can extract them otherwise. So we live in a period of extraordinary amount of data, perhaps not a lot of knowledge, but certainly lots of data. I'll look at the historical trends. I'll then look at drivers. I've already mentioned those. And then I'll talk about what that means for global temperatures. But I think the answer is already pretty self-evident. Okay, so databases that I use and ones that I can trust. For energy, I use a statistical review of world energy. This used to be the old BP Energy Outlook data. But don't be concerned by the fact that it started with BP. It's very reliable. That has a spreadsheet that lists almost every piece of energy data you could possibly want. It's even now including resources to do with critical minerals, for example, like lithium and cobalt and nickel and so on and so forth. So it's actually now an even enhanced set of data. That particular set of data presents historically primary energy from about 1965 onwards for a whole range of different sources, and also fossil fuel reserves and resources from 1965. It's also now moving into supplied energy, and it's moving away from primary energy. Just to explain those two terms, you might be familiar with them, but let me just go through them very quickly. Primary energy is basically the energy in the reserve. For example, it's the heating value of coal, heating value of natural gas, and so on. We have historically used primary energy because we were using fossil fuels, which are a resource, and we wanted to know how much was in the resource. Once you've used it, right? As we shift towards energy flows like renewables, so wind and solar and so on, the supplied energy becomes more critical. How much energy are these things actually producing? This used to be called secondary energy. Electricity is an example of supplied energy. When primary energy is used, secondary energy, for example, from renewables, is converted back to primary energy using an assumed energy efficiency, right? So, for example, you say let's run a superheated Rankine cycle. It's 41%, and if I generate that electricity from that, I get so many kilowatt hours, for example. And then if I had a solar system that's producing that, that's equivalent to that much primary energy. I will present things in both EJ and GJ, so 10 to the 18 and 10 to the 19 joules, and I'll use terawatt hours, which are 10 to the 12 watt hours and joules as well. Oops, jumped ahead there. The efficiency that's currently used for the conversion is 41%. The global carbon budget is what I use for carbon emissions. The Energy Outlook Statistical Yearbook of Energy also has energy CO2 emissions in it. This is a great source. It produces historical stuff back to 1850. You can read how they calculate carbon emissions back to 1850. It's extraordinary that they do, but it's there. And it includes energy by resource and type, cement production, everything, including land use and land use changes in forestry. Atmospheric, that's not a spreadsheet. So that is a spreadsheet that you can download. You can also get atmospheric concentrations from NOAA in the United States, if they're still producing those, he hastens to add. And they go back to, I think, the early 60s as well. So this is the Mauna Loa, Hawaii database, Scripps laboratory there for atmospheric concentrations. For the carbon budget, I'm using one of the latest updates. So this is how much carbon we have left to achieve a certain temperature. I'll use a paper by Foster et al., which is a recent publication. But it's basically repeating a lot of what you see in the IPCC, but it sort of gives more insight into the available carbon budget. Cumulative carbon emissions effectively give rise to linear changes in temperature. So we can, if you know how much carbon you're emitting over a specific period, you can pretty much work out what the increase in temperature is going to be from that. It's roughly linear over a limited period of time. And so what you see there is the probability of achieving a certain temperature rise, given at 67%, that's the probability of achieving that. So for example, we will, if we emit a further 80 gigatons of carbon, have a 67% chance of getting to 1.5. Right, that's what that effectively means. I will use these numbers here. So our carbon budget, which is the critical number for us, is 870. So in other words, if we emit more than 870, we have a 67% chance of exceeding the 2-degree limit. And as we like to say, and as we note in the book, if you had a 67% chance of surviving of landing in your aircraft, you wouldn't get on the aircraft, right? And this comes back to the precautionary principle. So our current temperature rise is roughly about 1.3. It's certainly gone over 1.3 and gone over 1.5, peaked at that, but the average when using the calculation methods that they use, it's 1.3. For GDP, I use the World Bank, and that's something you have to extract from that because it gives it to you in graphical form. Okay, so historical trends. I'll go through this quickly because you've probably seen a lot of this data, and I think some of you might be very familiar with it. I will only look at global data because I'm only interested in the atmosphere, effectively, and the atmosphere is global. Since 1965, we've seen extraordinary growth in primary energy. In the last 24 years, it's gone up by 60%. We'll talk about the reasons for that, but in essence, what we're seeing there is a continuation of a long-term trend. Yes, where the growth is occurring moves around the globe, but the growth globally is historical and has occurred for over 50 years. If we extract that into shares of primary energy, and I think, Daniel, one of your previous books looked at in detail energy shares. And I think that was, I've got that book on the table here somewhere. One of your last speakers was talking about some of these things. What we see in effect, if we look at shares, so this is how much of the primary energy is contributed to by a particular type of fuel. Coal has gone down, as someone noted earlier, and it's effectively been replaced by gas as a fossil fuel. So the rise of gas methane both as gaseous fuel and as liquefied fuel, dominantly just gaseous fuel, has occurred over recent period. Oil as a share has largely remained the same. Note, though, that these are going up, which means even though the shares are what they are, the shares might be going down. They're still going up in total. If we look at all fossil fuels, you see this line here. The decline of fossil fuels as a total share of all energy is really a product of the growth of renewables. Historically, it's been hydro. Hydro is still one of the dominant forms of renewable energy. Although I haven't included it here, traditional use of biomass is also one of the dominant forms, and probably the most dominant form, although I'm not including that in this discussion. Then you had the growth of nuclear during the 80s and 90s. Then nuclear started to plateau, and it's basically starting to recover a little bit from the decline that occurred post the turn of the century. And the recent drop-off in fossil fuels, of course, is due to the growth of wind and solar. And we'll talk in a bit, and that's of course, purely in electricity. Yes, there have been biofuels. Yes, there's been some bioenergy, but in essence, it's dominantly the growth of wind and now the growth of solar that's driving. There has been a moderate growth in hydro, but the capacity for hydro globally is very limited, and much open to debate about whether or not you'd put your investment into a 100-year life cycle hydro plant if the rain isn't going to be there in 20 years' time because of climate change. So it's certainly very limited compared to the others. Okay. Electricity production is where we've seen most of that growth in renewables, as we know. And so once again, I'm plotting here more recent data for electricity. I could go back to 1965, but it's the more recent data that's interesting. So the blue line here is fossil fuels. What we see is fossil fuel electricity production is growing and continues to grow at a rate which is fairly consistent over the last 20 to 30 years. There has been a significant recent upturn in renewables, so that the growth in renewables recently has outstripped the growth in fossil fuel electricity. But fossil fuel electricity continues to grow. Non-fossil fuel share is now 42% of generation, and it's increased its share since 2010. So the share is shown here. This is the share of fossil fuel. It's declining. Electricity generation accounts for about 43% of primary energy. So when you turn the secondary energy to primary energy, it accounts for 43%. So if you then have a look at the fraction of renewables as a fraction of the electricity as a fraction of primary energy, it's about 20% or so. So we have a long way to go, in other words, to electrify the full energy system. So what about the drivers for energy? So I want to look at population as a driver for energy. So if you plot energy against population, and I'll show you per capita consumption on the next slide, it's quite remarkable what you see. And so the blue line here is primary energy. The green line is just fossil fuels. So the difference is the growth in renewables. You see pretty much linear trends in population since about 1965. And even when you include things like the first and second oil shocks, the 1990s recession, the 2000s boom, the 2008 global financial crisis, and COVID, it is remarkable that energy consumption has bounced back after each of these extraordinary perturbations. And I just want you to think about what happened during COVID, right? We pretty much stopped most international travel, and a lot of travel was suppressed. And that's the decline that you see there, that tiny decline. Right? And there was also obviously significant downturn in global trade. We recovered that within a couple of years. And so these trends are extraordinarily robust. There can be extraordinary impacts on these trends, but the recoveries are strong and the trends are sustainable. If you extrapolate these through to the population we expect by 2050, we may see fossil fuels being 620 EJ, primary energy 750 EJ. Now, these are the 750 EJ is the sort of number that you typically get from most integrated assessment models for energy consumption by around 2050. So the trends are historically very strong and they're very robust. In other words, changing these trends is not going to be easy. The good news, of course, is down the bottom here, where we see the upturn in the growth of wind and solar. Now that accounts for the diverging trends of these two lines, but the growth rate here, even though it's strong, is going to give rise to very small changes in these trends over the period where we are very concerned about the total amount of CO2 that has been emitted to the atmosphere. So population as a driver, we look at now in terms of the per capita consumption. So we divide energy by the number of people and we plot it against the year. And so what you see is every single one of us is using more gas. We haven't changed individually, globally, our consumption of coal for about 30 years. In other words, coal consumption has kept pace with population. Oil, over the last couple of decades at least, post the 2000 boom, has been relatively constant as well. So when you look at it, every single one of us around the world for the last 20 to 30 years has pretty much used the same amount of fossil fuels per person. So as population goes up, fossil fuel use will continue at the rate of the per capita use. In other words, the population globally is one of the biggest indicators of energy use. Primary energy is showing, when we include renewable energy, is showing an increase over this period. And so what we're seeing is that, yes, we are increasing the amount of renewables per capita, but it's not displacing fossil fuel use. It's on top of the existing amount of fossil fuel use. And that's one of the big problems that we're facing at the moment. We continue to grow renewable energy, but it is not reducing fossil fuel use. And there has been some displacement of fossil fuel use in terms of the types of fossil fuels we use, but largely gas growth has not given rise to very much change in per capita use of coal and oil. So this is one of the underlying problems that we face. Keep on pressing the button, it doesn't work. There we go. What about atmospheric CO2 concentrations? Well, for every CO2 molecule that we, for every, I guess, CO2 molecule that we miss, half of it goes into the atmosphere if that's possible, a quarter of it goes to the ocean, and roughly a quarter goes to land. So roughly half of what we're emitting goes to the atmosphere, just in terms of proportions. And so what we're seeing here is atmospheric trends of that half that are emitted from energy systems largely. So the range of interest that we are trying to limit growth is already in the blue range here, which typically ranges from about 400 to 450. So 450 is typically where you're being concerned about reaching, the 1.5 to 2 degree limit. We're probably already getting very close to that 1.5 limit, as I said before. What's remarkable, of course, is that it too depends upon population. And I've put here what is the population trend line for the CO2. And you can see where we're going to be possibly if this continues by 2050. Once again, this is a systemic, deeply held and rigid trend line. We haven't seen great departures from this for a very long time, and we're unlikely to, certainly for the next, say, 10 to 20 years, I'd suggest. And what I'm showing on here is despite the fact that we have seen IPCC reports in 1992, 2001, 2014, I was involved in that one, so I'm partly to blame, 2021, these have had no impact on this trend at all. So who's listening? Who's listening to the signals that the atmosphere is giving us? Certainly the scientists and engineers are, but governments are not. Let's look at the global trends in carbon emissions now. So before I was showing you carbon in the atmosphere. Now I'm showing you emissions from energy systems, changes in agriculture, cement flaring, and other sources. So global carbon emissions against year. The black line here is our energy emissions, and the blue line includes land use, other land use changes in forestry, cement flaring, and other sources. So we can see once again, if I plot what is, I won't show you how I got that population trend here, but if I plot a population trend on this, this is the line that I get. As population growth starts to turn over a little bit, if you use the median UN predictions for population after about 2040 approaching 2050. These are the correlations that you get in terms of the production of CO2 emissions from those sources. If we take these trends and we calculate the cumulative CO2 that is emitted post this date, which is 2024, we would see 80 gigatons being emitted around 2026. We reach 240 not long thereafter. And by about 2044, 2042, we could expect to emit 870 gigatons of carbon if this trend holds true. And bear in mind that that's only about 20 years away. And if I just go back 20 years and say the year 2000, you can see how strong that trend is. There's an old saying in predictions, predict as far ahead as you are on the basis of how far the trend has occurred, right? So if you've got a 20-year trend, you can probably predict 10 to 20 years ahead. We have at least a 60-year trend there, so we're predicting 20 years is a pretty safe bet. The point, I suppose, is that if we don't turn these trends around, and we're unlikely to, we will definitely be exceeding 1.5, and we'll be doing that in a couple of years' time. We can expect to exceed, at least at a 67% probability, the 2-degree limit. And if we extend this to 2060, it's probably going to be closer to something like 2.3, 2.4 degrees. I can't see how we can avoid certainly 2 degrees at this point if this is true.
I have a question actually, because that point about trends, when they're based on specific technical options being available, doesn't that mean that when we extrapolate them into the future, we're making assumptions about the technological options that are available into the future as well? And that as a result, you might be missing the potential for that curve to flatten, essentially. Right, like the net effect would be a flattening of that curve.
So which technologies would be available to us at scale in the next 10 years? That would be my question to you. Yes, but I'll show you the rates of deployment of those and the increases in rates of deployment necessary to flatten that curve a bit later. But they're vastly higher than what they currently are, even with the growth we're seeing in China. So I agree with you. In other words, what's the old saying? Prediction is always difficult, particularly about the future. Who knows what could happen? I suppose if I go back, my intention of showing this plot here was to show how robust these trends are. Now, yes, of course, these don't include the impact of alternative technologies on them, but these are significant impacts on things like, certainly on things such as GDP. And the first and second oil shocks were things that impacted consumption. So you can see how quickly we rebound back to the trend, irrespective of the growth in other things. And so, yes, we've got significant growth in wind and solar, and we may see this go right up here, right? And this may start to turn over. So the fossil fuel one may start to turn over. But unless it's 870, divide that by the yearly production of about, let's say it's 800 and 880 for argument's sake, gigatons available to us. And we say we're putting out 40 gigatons a year, which is about what we're doing at the moment, roughly speaking. Well, what's that? 880 divided by 40, that's 22, right? So 22 years. Even if we turn that over, we might extend that to what, 30 years, 35? But what do we do after we've achieved 880? It doesn't go to zero. It keeps on going. And even if we turn it around and you integrate that, bringing 880 to zero is an extraordinarily difficult task. We might end up not getting 880. It might be 1200. It might be 1600. And so we're still getting to 2.5 degrees. And, once we're getting over 2.5 degrees, who knows what that means in terms of climate stability? We really just don't know. And anyone that tells you that they do is probably, extending their models well beyond credibility. So I agree with you, but there is so little carbon that we can emit to the atmosphere at the rates we are emitting it, that even vastly outrageous, unprecedented changes in energy will still mean those targets that are left to us are at risk, I would suggest. So I agree with you.
Simon,
the compression of time is the difficulty.
Tons to go through, but I
Yeah.
know we've only got a few minutes. And is this the question we should have a 10-minute discussion about, which is how do you create change, right? I don't know.
Well, so look, I agree with you. I can hammer this point and I can show you all these things, but I'm going to jump right ahead. So can we do that? So I think we're getting to the question here of what can we do? Should we do that?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah. So what many of you will be familiar with integrated assessment models. These are extraordinarily complex models which bring in economic modeling, climate modeling, a whole range of different things to try and work out what the future will look like in terms of energy. Well, let's forget all that nonsense and let's do some very simple calculations, right? I'm going to jump back one slide. One of the critical parameters is the amount of CO2 per unit primary energy that the energy system has. How much CO2 per unit primary energy? This is part of the Kaya identities, which I won't go through. So I'm interested in getting that to zero. If we had a fully green, fully renewable system, we imagined that system produced no carbon, plenty of primary energy, the CO2 per unit PE would be zero, right? It's currently, depending on how you calculate it, much closer to 60, right? So we've got to get 60 to zero. So what I'm showing here is the historical value of that in megatons per EJ, megatons of CO2 per EJ of energy. That's the historical trend. And you can see that it hasn't changed greatly since about 1980. So that our task is to bring this to zero if we're going to have a fully a sustainable energy system where we're not emitting any carbon, so-called net zero, if you will. If we predict the future of this based on recent declines in it, and it has been declining as renewables have been growing, and we just say, let's take a linear extension of this, a simple linear extension, right? We effectively get this plot here, right? Because it's a continuation of the trend that we're seeing. In other words, we could expect to reach our target of 870 by around 2043 or so. Now, 870 is up here. So what I've done for this one is only look at energy. The 870 target includes other sources for fossil fuels. So when I exclude those other sources and only look at energy as a source, I get a target which is about 730, which is equivalent to a 67% 2-degree temperature rise. So we can emit from our energy sources 730 gigawatts. All right. And what I'm trying to target is full electrification of our energy system. So in other words, all of our system ultimately will be producing energy electrically from renewable energy sources. So full electrification of our energy system would probably require us by 2050 to be at 90,000 terawatt hours. Now, there's some dispute about that, but it's close to 100. We're currently at 13. We have to be at 90 in effect. A business as usual reduction in our historical CO2 per unit primary energy would give rise to 34 by 2050. So 34 is a long way from 90. And it's the fact that we're still at a value of close to 40 in our emissions intensity is why we are going to exceed the target. Okay, that's the business as usual. What can we do about this? All right. Well, there's a range of things that we can do. We target full electrification of the energy system, heat and liquid fuels from green hydrogen. I can talk about that if you want. And biogenic carbon sources. We can also pull carbon from the atmosphere if you want to make liquid fuels. If we're going to fly aeroplanes, we're going to need liquid fuels. We target growth rates in renewable energy to yield an emissions intensity of 0 by 2060. I think the 2050 target's no good for us. We say that we need to be within a 730 gigaton limit of carbon. So we need to get this to 0 by 2060. And if we just target producing 730 and that's it, what do we need? Well, that's the decline we need in that historical value. That effectively means a threefold increase in the rate of RE rollout up to 2060. Right? It's a sustained threefold increase. Okay. Well, if we did that, then we could expect that that would achieve the 2-degree target. So we could come within the 2-degree target if we increased our production of renewable energy rollout by threefold and sustained that for the next 40 years, right? So that's one thing we could do. Now that sounds quite reasonable, but I would put a point of concern here about this. There is no guarantee that stabilizing temperatures at 2 degrees will stabilize climate. And someone mentioned this before, and I think Nick, you did as well. There are feedbacks in the climate system which will kick in once we start to approach 2 degrees. So natural sources of methane in particular, from the tundra and calthrates and other things, will start to be produced. The heat in the oceans will continue to come out. There will be continued decline in ice cover in both the Arctic and Antarctic. That will give rise to changes in global albedo, and so on and so forth. So we cannot guarantee that simply rolling out vast amounts of renewables will give rise to the sorts of climate stability we would hope by 2060, even if we come within the carbon limit. Now, that's always going to be true once we get above about 1.5. Those feedback systems are very complex and only now being started to be understood. But they give rise to ongoing problems, irrespective of climate stabilization, irrespective of carbon emissions. So we need to get much lower than that value of 730. Well, what else could we do? Well, we reduce consumption. How much do we have to reduce consumption by? Well, let's have a look at one example of this. We sustain our rate of rollout of renewables by a factor of 3 for the next 40 years, maybe 30 years in this case. But what we do is we say, let's hold current consumption of energy at its present value, which effectively means that by 2060, we've had a 20% decrease in the per capita consumption of energy. Now, hopefully we've solved some equity problems as well. In other words, the West has decreased the wealthy countries have decreased their consumption by maybe 40%, maybe 50%, and handed a lot of that consumption over to energy poor countries with low energy access. So we've got to solve that problem as well. But if we sustain that level of consumption to 2060, we emit 472 gigatons of carbon, which means we reach about 1.8 degrees. Now, 1.8 is still very close to 2 degrees. And it doesn't guarantee us of climate stability. But what I want to get across here is that even with extraordinary rates of rollout of renewable energy to 2050, unprecedented rates sustained for a very long time, and we hold consumption constant at our present value, which means a 20% reduction, we will still see the temperature rise to about 1.8 degrees centigrade, roughly. And I note once again that that doesn't guarantee climate stabilization. Right? So these are historically unprecedented changes that need to occur in the next 20 to 30 years if we are to reach these values. And I want to emphasize the strength of the historical trends that we have seen and the difficulty of overcoming the robustness of those trends. So where does that leave us? All right, achieving and stabilizing global average temperature rise to less than 2 degrees by 2050 will require a combination of very rapid rollout in our resources, that's obvious, combined with significant reductions in energy use. The level of change is unprecedented. Achieving full electrification of energy system by 2050, 2060 will require rapid deployment of energy storage systems and very possibly green hydrogen. Talk about that if you want. These both act to place greater demand on energy as they are inefficient given inputs required. In other words, putting more batteries on, having green hydrogen in the system lowers system EROI. They're just, batteries require a lot of energy. There are plenty of other energy storage systems like methanol and liquid fuels that we can use as well. But once again, each time you convert that primary energy like sun, or like solar, into some other lower form of energy, even though it is storage, you're reducing the ROI, which means energy inputs go up in it. So all of these place greater demand. And full electrification of the energy system requires all of those things for it to work globally. Yes, we can connect globally. Yes, we can have plenty of onshore and offshore wind to try and balance out loads across the globe. But there are plenty of places where that will be very difficult. And if we're going to start putting in huge grid connections through Asia under the ocean, on the ocean floor, that once again will take a long time and it's very expensive energetically. And even having done all of that, there's no guarantee that once we get above 1.5 and are approaching 2, that will stabilize the climate. So I apologize for the speed and the way I've jumped all around all of that. What did they say? Pessimist is a realistic optimist. I hope to be a realistic optimist. I'm not saying that we can't do this. I'm just saying it's unprecedented. It's extraordinary. If we'd started 30 years ago, I'd be saying this is all pretty straightforward, but we didn't.
Thank you so much, Damon.
Thank you, Damon. It is
I'm
unprecedented.
Pass over to Nick.
No. I just want to thank you for coming to talk to us. We can stick around for a few minutes if people want to, but I'm conscious that we said 7:30 till 9 o'clock, so you're certainly under no obligations to stick around. But maybe just as a brief flag of the next book club. So Heather and I had a phone call last week, and we've decided for our next book, my apologies, Julienne, because it's somewhat antipodean, is The Snowy, a memoir, which is a history, which is about the Snowy hydro schemes. So this is our last book for the year, and no offense, Damon, but this one will be a fun, rollicking read. I'm
sure it will be.
Not realistic pessimism. So, but which is certainly what we need. But anyway, we'll announce a date for that, and also probably for the next book club, if you can come prepared to answer the 2 questions. I would like to do a book club every how frequently? So that's a question we want to have for setting up for next year. Do we do it every 2 months? Is that too often? Is that too little? And also a book I would really love to do is X, which we've already picked our first couple for next year as well. We'll be doing Vault Rush. So, anyway, sorry, you go, Heather.
Yeah, I was going to say we are going to take Julian up on his suggestion and do Vault Rush. And we're going to do, can you remember, Nick?
It was one Peter suggested, which was How Big Things Get Done, which is sort of my understanding is it's to say, why is the learning rate negative for nuclear and why is it so good for solar and wind and other kinds of technologies? So it's not specifically about energy, but it is about doing big things, which, as Damon tells us, a sustained 3-fold RE rollout for the next 40 years is nobody would dispute that that's a big thing. So
Can I
I-
suggest before we shut everything down that we just do one reflection from everyone, and before we say goodbye, just so we hear from everyone. There's only a few of us in the room today, so Jim, would you like to give us one reflection?
I could. I was just going to second how big things get done. It's extraordinary, complete game changer in terms of how I thought. So yeah, my reflections. Yeah, no, I think it's just always this tension between what's possible and what we need to do, which can be very distressing to think about. Which is just always kind of coming back to, well, you individually we don't have to do everything, but we have to do something. So that's the kind of making sure that we're all finding out something is probably what you do in the face of some fairly overwhelming data and challenges.
And my reflection is similar. I've been watching Nate Hagen's, whose video I've put in the chat there, and he talks about our responses being doomer and techno-optimist. And of course, we both, when you're given one or the other, you critique it and you sort of try to drag people back towards some sort of central thing. So that narrative about what we can do, how we can change, I think is super important, because I found myself wanting to critique Damon's and then go, yeah, but the whole time. Julian?
I was just gonna say, I think I Googled a little bit around for paper as well. We were talking, and I just put a couple of the ones that I use for claims because I think some people here might be interested in them. But also, I've came across the SME work that you did on Eroy with your student, Damon. So I look forward to looking into that because I think that was part of what was missing like 3 years ago when I was looking into Eroy in terms of more recent assessments that were process-based and bottom-up. So I was smiling when you were explaining it because it sounded like a fantastic way to do it and stuff that the economists were not doing. So thanks for that.
Good, thank you.
And thanks for engaging with all the annoying questions.
Rachel?
I had Nick as a student for a long time.
No, I was just going to say, yeah, I think the optimism part of it. Like, obviously, we've got to do something. So looking at all the different avenues, but the equity part of it as well, and trying to figure out how we can do something. At least it's not doom and gloom. There is a possibility. So yeah, looking at all avenues is, yeah. Thank you for your time. It's very interesting.
Look, I should just on an optimistic note. You said Australia is uniquely placed to take advantage of this this change, right? I mean, who wouldn't want to be in Australia with the opportunities that we have available to us to provide, the solutions for the future of energy, right? I mean, we have more resources than we really know what to do with. We have, which we need to put out in a sustained and careful way. We have extraordinary reserves of energy. We have brilliant minds in Australia that can work on these problems. We are a stable, dare I say, democratic country, positioned in the centre of global growth. I mean, the opportunities are extraordinary, and if we don't take, the leap into this to show the moral leadership globally, how can we expect anybody else to solve this problem, right? And this is the thing I get most cross about. Oh, Australia's only very small. Well, who cares, right? Our moral leadership can be extraordinary, right? And that's how we measure impact, not about how big we are, but how much influence and impact we have. And surely that's where we should be putting our energy, to kind of word. All right, look, Nick, is there any other comments that you wanted to make?
No,
that's my optimistic note.
I think we'll close the meeting on that. And I think, thank you very much, Damon, for your time. Thank you, everybody, for making the book club so great. and I think we all can, yes, go forward and think about what we're going to do to contribute to that sustained threefold increase in RE rollout for the next
And if
40
anyone's got
years.
any questions or wants any
sharing it with
data,
the rest of the world.
data sources or links to those, just send me an email. I'm pretty easy to find.
Can I share your slides, Damon, with our mailing
Yeah,
list?
of course. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that might be the easiest thing to do, Nick. But I haven't got a lot of the references in there. But if anyone wants specific references, and if you're not, I think a lot of you are doing study, but Jim might not have any access. If he wants access to papers or something, I'm sure we can rustle them up through the various libraries we have access to.
Right.
Great.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you,
Nice to meet you all,
everybody.
and thanks for inviting me.
Thanks.
Thank
guys.
you very
Thanks,
much.
Nick.
Have a great day.